Nikon D3300 Review. One of the biggest camera announcements at 2014's Consumer Electronics Show may well have been the little Nikon D3300 and its collapsible 18-55mm f3.5-5.6 VR2 lens. It may not shoot 4K video or offer a curved LCD. Those shows are all about the tech trends, but it does represent the next generation of Nikon's very popular entry-level DSLR line, and that in itself is noteworthy. The D3300 sits at the bottom of Nikon's entry-level series, positioned as the friendliest of beginner-friendly DSLRs, just below the D5300. Don't be fooled by their class bearing though. Both cameras use a powerful 24MP APS-C sensor. Opting for the D3300 rather than the D5300 means living with a fixed 3.0-inch LCD, rather than one that's fully articulated, and no built-in Wi-Fi. Nikon D3300 key features: 24.2 MP DX-format, APS-C, sensor Expeed 4 processor fixed 3.0, 921K LCD 1080-60p HD video 5 FPS continuous shooting 700 shot battery life. The D3300's Expeed 4 branded processor is responsible for many of its gains over the previous model, the D3200. This model gets an upgrade to 1080-60p video recording, an extra frame per second in burst mode, and a higher ISO range up to 12,800, 25,600 with expansion. Specs comparison. The table below illustrates the differences between this model, its predecessor, and the step-up model. It should be noted that the D3300 appears to give better battery performance than the D5300, but actually they use the same NEL14A battery. The D5300's lower claimed battery life reflects a calculation for use of the camera's built-in Wi-Fi and GPS. By any measure, the D3300 is well above its peers in terms of battery capacity. Moving up the chain of Nikon's crop-frame DSLR line, AF systems get increasingly sophisticated. The D3300 sits at the very bottom with an 11-point system and a single cross-type sensor at the middle, nothing that would tempt a sports photographer, but perfectly capable for its class. Outside of this, Wi-Fi and a vari-angle screen are the only other clear hardware advantages to the D5300 over the entry-level model. The comparison paints a picture of a nicely specified entry-level model with excellent battery life, a new processor and a whole lot of resolution. Aside from the lack of Wi-Fi, there's not much to complain about here, and we don't feel that there's anything that this camera is seriously lacking feature-wise. However, the days when an entry-level Nikon only really had to worry about its latest rival from Canon have gone. So, although the D3300's specs are very impressive, especially in terms of battery life, it also has to hold its own against the smaller mirrorless cameras that match it for image quality and offer a more compact camera-like live view shooting experience. Though a little long in the tooth, the Panasonic Lumix GF6 offers a tilting touchscreen, and the Olympus EPM2 provides a fixed touchscreen and is a steal price-wise compared to the rest of the class. Elsewhere in the category, the Pentax K500 offers a 100% coverage optical viewfinder and 6 FPS burst shooting, while the Fujifilm X-A1 offers twin command dials and built-in Wi-Fi. Kit options and pricing. The Nikon D3300 is available in black, gray and red variants, kitted in the US and UK with a collapsible 18-55mm f3.5-5.6 VR2 lens with list prices of $649.95 and £599.99, respectively. In the UK there's also a £499.99 body-only option, not offered in the US. Without the D5300's built-in Wi-Fi, D3300 owners will need to add Nikon's WA1A mobile adapter for connectivity features. The adapter dangles from the camera's Avenue port, making it possible to wirelessly transfer images to an Android or iOS device. Read more about it in our review of the Nikon D3200. It's available separately for $59.95/£54.99. Nikon's DSLRs aren't by any means the cheapest in their respective classes, and that's true of the D3300. It's about $100 US more than a comparable Canon kit, and costs well over twice as much as the very aggressively priced Sony A3000. For that premium, you get one of the highest resolution APS-C sensors on the market, a very good 1080 to 60p video spec, and exceptional battery life among other things. It's slightly pricier, but does the feature set justify the tag? Or would your entry-level dollars be better spent elsewhere? being an entry-level model, the D3300 has a seemingly plastic shell that's not. The camera feels well balanced, thanks in most part to a deep, sculpted hand grip. The rear command dial is easily within reach of the right thumb. The grip is somewhat slim, and can be uncomfortable to hold for an extended amount of time. Viewfinder. The D3300's viewfinder offers 95% coverage, and with 0.85x magnification it's slightly larger than the D5300's 0.82x viewfinder, and larger still than the D3200's 0.80x viewfinder. The Pentax K500 leads the class in terms of coverage with an uncharacteristic 100% OV and 0.92x magnification. The diagram below shows the D3300 to be average for the class. Body elements. The D3300's ports are ranged down its left flank, behind two separate rubber covers. From the top, these are a GPS/remote socket, a mic port, still relatively rare in a product at this level, the USB/Avenue port, and an HDMI connector. The use of two separate port doors makes use of the optional WA1A Wi-Fi adapter a little more practical. It pushes into the USB/Avenue port, requiring the door to remain wedged open while in use. On the rear of the D3300 is the second of two IR receivers on the camera, back again after being omitted from the D3100 and reintroduced in this camera's predecessor. The D3300's The card slot is located on the side of the camera rather than with the battery compartment. This makes working in a tripod more pleasant and is something that often gets missed off entry-level cameras, in the name of downsizing or cost saving. The D3300's battery compartment is neatly slotted inside its hand grip, and is accessible via a hinged door on the base of the camera. The D3300 uses the NEL14A battery, that offers up to 8.9 Wh of energy and is rated at 700 shots per charge, using SIPA standard testing. A tripod socket sits in line with the lens axis, and far enough away from the battery compartment door that changing the battery when the camera is mounted on a tripod shouldn't be a problem. Operation and controls. In the auto and scene modes, the D3300 behaves very much as a point-and-shoot, with very little user intervention required or allowed. You get control over focus and flash modes, but that's about it. Guide mode is a middle ground. You take control of the camera's exposure settings using usage scenario logic, but it's on switching to the POSIM modes that the D3300 really comes into its own. From the top you can see the D3300's flash, shown here in its closed, stowed position, and the hot shoe, which can accept any of Nikon's current range of speedlight flashes. The left-hand side of the top plate is bare, but on the right of the pentamirror you can see a cluster of control points, info button, movie start/stop, and exposure compensation, along with the mode dial. The basic exposure parameters, shutter speed, aperture, and exposure compensation, are all handled by the well-placed rear thumb wheel in concert with the exposure compensation button. This layout makes changing these settings fairly quick and fluid, though the twin dials of the Fujifilm X-A1 are a step ahead. We also like Nikon's dedication of the 4-way controller to selecting a focus point manually. Combined with the 11-point AF system, this makes focusing on off-center subjects a breeze, without having to always focus and recompose for every shot. The rear dial handles either shutter speed or aperture in the semi-manual modes. In full manual mode, the dial sets shutter speed at default. Pressing and holding the exposure compensation button switches it to aperture. It's still possible to apply exposure compensation in manual exposure mode via the I menu, which either applies a bias to the target shown by the meter, or adjusts the image brightness directly, if you have auto ISO engaged. The other shooting controls, ISO, white balance, focus mode and the like, are all set from the active control panel on the rear display, accessed by pressing the I button. Likewise, live view is accessed by pressing the LV button, which you'll need to do in order to record video. The D330 also offers a customizable function button on the front of the camera near the lens mount. With just a handful of settings it can be tasked with accessing. The exposure log button on the rear next to the command dial can also be customized to handle focus and/or exposure only. Here are all of your options. The function button acts as a direct control to whichever setting it's assigned. Pressing and holding the FN button makes it possible to use the command dial to change the setting. This means that the user has direct access to either shutter speed or aperture, depending on the shooting mode, exposure compensation, and another setting like ISO. For a beginner learning the basics of exposure, that's probably enough. Interface. The D330 features a slightly more condensed, quick menu than is offered in its bigger siblings like the D5300, omitting active D-lighting access, but all of the essentials are present. The command dial can't be used in either selecting a function or setting it. We were annoyed by this behavior in the D5300, since use of the command dial would make changing settings just a little bit quicker. But D330 users who we expect to be using one of the automated modes more often may not find this as irritating. This camera is targeted more clearly toward a user moving up from a point-and-shoot, so this point-and-shoot-like interface is likely not a problem, unless that user has ambitions beyond that approach. The Info button on the top of the camera toggles this settings display on and off. Two rows of settings are stacked along the bottom of the display. Pressing the I button on the back panel activates the quick menu, highlighting the item that was last accessed. The four-way controller is used to navigate between settings. Unlike many of its rivals, there's no option to then directly change the setting, though. Instead, pressing the OK button brings up a submenu where the desired setting can be changed by using the directional buttons. Again, the dial remains unused. Help screens are available to explain various camera and exposure functions. Highlighting an item on the quick menu and pressing the button, also the zoom out button on the back panel, will bring up this informational screen. Losing the shortcut to active D lighting is disappointing, but doesn't feel like a huge loss since it's only available in on/off states. The D5300 offers more control over ADL modes. It can be assigned to the customizable FN button, but that requires giving up your only means of direct access to ISO. The D330 does not offer a touchscreen, and neither do most of its entry-level DSLR peers. However, touchscreens can be found among the mirrorless competition. The Olympus EPM2 and Panasonic GF6 both offer one. We think that those moving to a more advanced camera and are accustomed to point-and-shoot or smartphone interfaces would feel at home with a touchscreen. Diving into the camera menu is the only way to turn ISO auto on or off. From this screen you can also set a maximum sensitivity and minimum shutter speed. What's missing here? The D330 offers the chance to customize your auto minimum shutter speed, rather than simply following the 1/equivalent focal length rule. In the D330, this option is not available. Settings like white balance and focus mode are accessed in the same way as in viewfinder shooting, by pressing the I button. In PA shooting modes, the screen will brighten and darken to reflect any exposure compensation set. This won't happen in manual exposure mode, but the exposure meter will show exposure in 1/3 f increments on a plus or minus 2f scale. Unfortunately, the D330's live view mode still shows the same odd quirk that we saw on the D330 and had first appeared on the D300. When you enter live view, the camera will stop down to the currently set or metered aperture value, offering an undocumented depth of field preview in the process. But what it can't then do is readjust the diaphragm live if you change the aperture setting. It will honor the specified aperture when actually making an exposure, and indeed return to live view at that aperture afterwards. Alternatively, you can force it to readjust by exiting and re-entering live view. This can give a misleading impression of the depth of field you'll end up getting, and it further complicates manual focus as you have to remember to always initiate live view at an appropriate aperture, normally with the lens wide open. Even more confusing is this overlap with movie recording and manual exposure mode. Enabling manual movie mode in the menu sets a 1/60 minimum shutter speed when you use manual exposure mode in live view. It also prohibits the user from changing the aperture value, which the camera can't change during live view, anyway. This is designed to give a better experience for those who want to shoot video with control over all exposure parameters. More on that in the video section of this review, but is potentially confusing, especially if you've forgotten to disengage it after recording video some time ago. In addition to this, grid view is an image-only option with the exposure parameters displayed along the bottom of the screen. The small white hash marks at the left and right of the display show the 16:9 video crop that you'll see as soon as the record button is pressed. This shooting view displays stills shooting information such as white balance and drive mode along the top of the screen. Video display replaces the white hash marks with light gray, transparent bars to mark the 16:9 crop. They're impossible to see when shooting with a dark background, unfortunately. To the camera's credit, it shows audio levels on this screen. Anyway, let's not dwell on the negative. The D330 is an entry-level camera that provides an appropriate level of direct access to controls, a perfectly fine, collapsible kit zoom lens and 24 megapixels of resolution. That's a whole lot of pixels to play with. They come in handy when you want to crop for a slightly different composition, as I did with the image above. And though battery life isn't a terribly exciting feature, the D330 has plenty of it, and that's a very good thing. It's just one more way that the D330 feels reliable. For the most part, shooting with the D330 is a simple and straightforward experience. Everything I need is here, though not necessarily everything I want. There are rarely times when the camera feels like it's getting in my way, but neither is it particularly engaging. Things like a level gauge would make the experience feel a little more pleasant. The ability to use the command dial to scroll through the quick menu would make changing settings a little bit quicker. But especially for a camera at this level, the lack of these features doesn't sting quite as much as it did with the pricier, upper entry-level D330. However, Being aimed at those moving up from point-and-shoot cameras, the D330 might let down an entry-level user in a few notable ways. The camera's slow live view may be a source of disappointment to users moving up from compacts. The camera's behavior in full auto is another potential problem. On one occasion I set out with the camera at sunset and kept it in full auto mode. Turning off the flash, I snapped away without paying much attention to exposure parameters, discovering later a number of my telephoto images were blurry because the camera had chosen shutter speeds and ISO as if I'd been shooting with the flash turned on.